Hi everyone, my name is Suma and this is Stephen Robbins. He's a rabbi and he's co-founder of Academy of Jewish Religion in California. He also has a doctorate in psychology. He has had 8 near-death experiences and 13 major surgeries. So I think it would be valuable to hear about his experience of consciousness as well as his perception of spirituality and brain science. Hi, Stephen.
Hello, Suma. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
And thank you for being open to share your rich experience. I think what you have gone through is, it sounds like a really big thing to go through.
Thank you. Up until a few years ago, I never talked about any of this. And in my 6th near-death experience, I was told to go talk to a group I'd never heard about called the International Association for Near-Death Studies, and to send them a message about their organization being the one platform that could teach people that the next stage of human evolution would be to no longer be afraid of death. And when that fear eased, that much of the negative forces that drive us would begin to diminish, and we could begin to work as one humanity rather than people, nations, religions, cultures competing for some kind of supremacy, because that only creates death and destruction. So I began, I guess I was about 71 or so when I first began to talk about it. I never even told my wife about it because, like so many people who've had NDEs, they feel that no one will really understand them. And since I live in a pretty mystical world anyway, I just was very conscious of alienating even my wife. But as I've unloaded all of this, she says, and now I understand you better.
And now you are 76?
77.
77.
I turned 77 this May.
Can you share about your near-death experiences? Like 8 near-death experiences are a lot, and what did you learn from them?
My 8 cover the arc of my life. So they're not compressed into a single span of years. They begin with my being born dead, strangled by the umbilical cord, and without the details, the doctor himself who had survived wounding by the kamikazes in the Pacific brought me back to life by taking me from the nurse who was going to register me as stillborn and essentially did infant CPR. That's 1944. And when they looked at him as if he was crazy, he just said something came over me. And we talked about this when I went to see him in 1969. And what I remember from all of that is beginning not at my birth or death in the womb, but becoming a soul in the first place before I entered the physical world. And that's that pre-life experience or pre-physical life experience then gives me a different perspective on the other 7 ones. One which was in 64, when I was just turning 20. I had severe hepatitis, ran a temperature of 107, left and came back twice, was told I was going to die because 80% of my liver had been destroyed. And so I spent a year just recuperating on my own, and came back and went back to school. Then in 1985, I caught a type A influenza. Those years they didn't have the name pandemic, but it was a type A influenza that came from the Philippines, and it destroyed most of the lining of my lungs, so that in '87 my lung collapsed, near-death experience. I recovered. '91 I had another lung collapse, near-death experience, return. Then I went until 2005 when I had the next lung collapse, and I was in the hospital that time for almost 6 weeks before they could get my lungs functioning. And just as I was getting ready to leave and go home, I got hit with a massive shingles infection that destroyed all the nerves on my skin and my muscles from the middle of my vertebrae around to the center of my belly. That left me with level 10 pain, which I still have for 16 years. I used to be on opioids. I got myself off of them, and so I use the spiritual healing meditative methodologies I use to manage the skin pain, and with the muscle cramping I take some muscle relaxants. That's all I'm on. But then in January of 17 I had the 6th near-death experience, which I mentioned, and that was when I had been to the doctor at UCLA. My driver brought me home, and he found that I wasn't breathing, and he couldn't find a heartbeat. So he called 911, laid me down on the concrete in front of my house, began to do CPR. The medics came. They took me to Hollywood Presbyterian, where they couldn't find heartbeat, and I wasn't breathing. So by that time, it was probably about 45 minutes to an hour. And then they decided to intubate me to get me to breathe. And as the tube went in, my hand came up and pushed it away, which pretty much surprised everybody. And then the doctor figured it was just a muscular response. He did it a second time. This time my hand came up, grabbed it, pushed it away, and they heard me say, the doctors, the nurses, and by that time my driver friend Felipe heard me say, "Don't do that to me. You'll hurt me, you'll kill me." And I wasn't breathing, and I wasn't, didn't have a heartbeat. So they just stopped. And when they turned to Felipe, they said, "What do we do?" And he said, "The rabbi is a very unusual man. So just stay with him and keep him company and see what happens." And 45 minutes later, I came back and was in recovery for about another hour, and then I got up and went home.
You didn't have heartbeat for 45 minutes?
Yeah. Well, I didn't have it for, must have been almost 2 hours. And all of that's in the medical records. So, and then in that I had messages. I went to IONS, who I didn't know about. I met a person there who ran the LA chapter. They did a video of me. I talked about the message to IONS. That got transferred to the board, and they asked me to make a presentation, which I did. I'm afraid I caused some trouble there, but it got IONS discussing what to do with all their research. And at the same time, they introduced me to Nelson Abreu and his wife Minori with the Academy for Consciousness, and then they introduced me to you. And that's how we all got here. And in each of those near-death experiences, something very different always happened to me. And in each of them, there were things I learned about me, things I learned about others, images of the nature of consciousness of the soul and of how to apply that. And my studies in psychology were in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma in early childhood and how that leads to hyperactive autoimmune disorders such as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and the correlation of those post-traumatic diseases which have flares that are autoimmune and the unresolved trauma in early childhood. So that's what I wrote my dissertation on, and it's now being used to deal with trauma by a number of institutions back east at Harvard. And I have my own practice integrating the spiritual work that I do with the scientific studies I've had and my background in Kabbalah. Kabbalah is most misunderstood by most Jews. My family is a family that's been practicing and teaching Kabbalah for back to the 1500s and even later, earlier, probably back to the beginning of the Common Era. So when I have my experiences, they include ancestors, both in the family line and in the spiritual descent line. So before I had the formal structure of Kabbalah to teach with, I experienced all that the words of Kabbalah were teaching. So I integrate the knowledge of Jewish mysticism, pre-Kabbalistic teaching, and integrate it with contemporary psychology, contemporary physiology and anatomy as a way of doing psychological and physical healing work. The seventh NDE occurred on January 8, of 18, when my consciousness seemed to collapse. I didn't know who I was or where I was. I lost the whole sense of being in place. I couldn't identify my wife, and then eventually I couldn't speak. And they took me to the emergency room, and they thought that I had some kind of brain collapse, a stroke or a heart attack, none of which happened. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And they sent me back from Hollywood Presbyterian to Cedars, and they ran a series of brain exams, an EEG, and a SPECT scan. That's where the brain shows in colors. And the doctor said, "Your brain is perfect. It's really astounding for a man your age." But then on the EEG, they found that in my right temporal lobe, there's a very small place where I have a silent seizure. And that's what caused it. So then I've been on medication and I don't have it anymore. But in that, I had the experience of meeting many souls who had been dying of COVID and who were filled with anguish because they didn't need to die. There was thoughtlessness and the feeling that their lives weren't important. And they asked me if I could find a way to speak out for them. So the only platform I had at that point was Zion's, and I raised the issue with them, and they began running groups which were ways of meeting people who've had near-death experiences to come and talk about what they've learned, what they feel, and I began sharing what I'd heard. And the last one happened on May 7th of last year, which my 76th birthday, when I collapsed. They took me to the hospital, and I had pneumonia and blood clot in my left lung. I had was unconscious. I had massive organ failure, and they were sure that I had a COVID infection, but I kept turning up negative. But in that one, I met and saw this whole planet and all of the souls who didn't need to die because we were all separate and not working together. And that this last election would be about whether or not humanity would choose to survive, to save itself, save the planet, and save the sharing of our wealth, our knowledge with each other. And of course, we are now in the midst of a new kind of government here, which is built around empathy and caring. But what the prior government unleashed around the world is this sense of autocracy and the diminution of the importance of the average person. And so we know that there are millions of people who've had NDEs from COVID and from other other reasons. For example, we know that 4 to 6% of the American population has had NDEs or will have them in the next several years. Realize how many millions of people that is who have them and are silent about them. But they come back transformed, and they don't know how to articulate that. And if that percentage is true here in America, the research that IANS has done has found that that percentage is true all around the world. So there's all these voices that have one thing in common. They are no longer afraid of death. And basically, they're no longer afraid of anything because they know that life, that living, is an ongoing process, and that being in the world of the physical, as the rabbis say, thank God, is very short, because this is the most difficult stage of being, and that the next stages of our being will be longer and much more fruitful when we put to practice the lessons that we learn here.
What did you learn about death in general because of all these experiences? And because death is something very, like, there is a lot of pain and suffering attached to that experience, and a lot of grief attached to the idea of death. What is your, because you had these experiences, has that changed for you?
Well, I am no longer afraid of death because I know that there is no death. In fact, a very famous conservative Jewish theologian named Gilman wrote a book called The Death of Death. And it is a look through the history of Jewish thought to arrive at the understanding that death is the greatest of all illusions, next to safety and control. There is neither safety nor control in this world. There is only learning to live in balance and in harmony as things change. Because at the core of my experience, prior to all my studies as a rabbi, which began, by the way, when I was 16, before I graduated high school, I started Hebrew Union College and had my first congregation at 16. So I've been doing this for 60 years. And I was ordained at Hebrew Union College in 1972. So this will be my 50th year since my ordination in 2022. I have come to understand that when it says in the book of Genesis, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because then you will die. But in fact, the grammar of that word really doesn't mean you will die. It really means it will die or he will die, meaning the illusion of death will die. And you will know that there is no death. And when Adam becomes Adam and Eve, they know until they have to leave the garden that death is an illusion and that it is love that binds us together. It is the fear of death that drives us apart in this world. Death is a real thing because the soul leaves the body and the physical body dies because it is the soul that sustains it. One of our mystic texts, the Zohar, says that the body is like a shoe for the soul's foot. So only a small portion of the soul is in the body. And that when the body finally can no longer sustain the weight of its own being, the soul slips out of the body like a hare slipping out of milk, quietly and peacefully. So those of us who've had near-death experiences deal with the fear and the anguish of illness on this side because we are taught to fear what death may bring and instead learn to let go so that whatever may happen happens peacefully without the struggle. So for example, when I work with people with cancer, we're going to fight cancer. And the more you fight, the harder the struggle becomes. You have to embrace the cancer and flood it with love, because cancer is a loveless disease. And when you fill it with the light, with the joy of loving, you actually begin to subdue it. All of the poison that we put in it only sustains it because like all other viruses, it learns to adapt to poison, like COVID-19. So learning not to embrace death, but not to fear it, and to learn to work with our bodies so that we can heal it, brings us back into life with a new sense of certainty and knowledge. So, as I said, I've been there many times. I've had 13 surgeries, beginning at 1.5, and 2.5, and 3.5, and on through my life. I've had both my shoulders replaced. They're titanium, and both of my wrists have titanium clips in them. And then I have to have both my knees replaced to become titanium, but my back fell apart, and now my back is being supported by titanium structures. So I say I'm like an old car getting a new chassis. And it is learning to live with a sense not of faith nor of belief, which always have an element of doubt built into them, but with something in Hebrew called bitachon, which is trust, confidence, and certainty that the challenge which I am given is being given only to see if I will raise myself to the next level of knowing. So in my life, I don't suffer. much of the time. Occasionally there's times when I end up feeling sorry for myself, and my wife helps me out of it. But most of the time I live the way I do now, even though I have a level 7 pain going on this side of my body, and I'm living in this medieval looking armor that is holding my 2 back surgeries together until I can begin to walk and stand on my own. So I know that every physical challenge I face will ultimately be a psycho-spiritual challenge for me to rise to my own occasion, and that becomes a way of teaching others. So for example, if I told you about all the things that happened to me, then that was okay, so he had them and came out of it. But what I'm talking to you about is all of the events that are happening to me now, what I'm living with now, and how what I've learned can help everybody live with it by learning to surrender fear. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, that was very clear. Do you think this gave you a glimpse into what really happens after death?
Oh yes, I have a very clear image.
Can you share about that, what really happens?
Through this group, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, which have been studying this phenomenon for 40 years, there is a phenomenology of near-death experience. It is the leaving of one's body, the viewing of it in its death or dying state, and the movement away from the body through an aperture, a tunnel, a flowing river, something through which there is a transition out of this world and being greeted by other presences, by other souls or relatives, or by what people call angels. But in our tradition, my tradition, we don't call them angels. The word in Hebrew is called malach, which means a messenger, one who comes to deliver a message and do work. The Greek and then the Latin and the English translations turned that word into angel. But these aren't angels that fly around in the way that contemporary culture sees them. They come with specific purposes and specific services. So my malachim, my guides, who brought me into the world and have helped me come out of it, have also been there to help me come back in. And I will tell you that with all the pain I live with, that the most painful thing is coming back into this body. Because once you leave the physical, there is this enormous sense of relief. The way I put it for me, having lived with collapsed lungs and always struggling to breathe in one way or another, to suddenly realize that I don't have to breathe in order to be, was always this astounding and joyful revelation, so that I no longer struggle to breathe. So I teach a meditation system in which, like CPR, we receive a breath by someone who wants us, who needs us to live. There is a verse in Genesis 2:7 that says, "And God breathed the breath of living into Adam, and Adam became a living being." And so my experience began with that wonderful doctor breathing into me. And when we speak together like this, we are breathing in and out of each other. We are sharing the breath of life. Whether we are mouth to mouth, or simply eye to eye, or more importantly, presence to presence, we are sustaining each other. So instead of taking a breath, we receive a breath, which means that instead of having to take something as a result of some battle or conflict, we receive that which is given, because the breath is not only the breath itself, but it is the love of the one who gives it. Whether it's God, or whether it was the first time I kissed my absolutely wonderful wife of 48 years, and it was that same kiss as from the doctor that breathed the whole life into me. And that instead of exhaling, we breathe ourselves back out. We return that which is given, and we are inhaled. Excuse me. We are inhaled back in by that presence in which there's a union before we are breathed back into. So it's inspire, because that's what inspire means. Expire, and then respire. And those are the three dimensions of the Jewish soul. Ruach, consciousness, which is like the wind. It goes everywhere without limits. Nefesh, life force in the body, which we surrender when we leave this world. And respire is the respiration that continues in a cycle. And so, it is the upside down triangle in the Jewish star, in which we are receiving breath, returning it, and then joining in the silence of it, in the union with the Holy One. And so we learn in this world to breathe in and out of each other. And when in the next world, when breath is no longer necessary, what I experienced was meeting all those souls that were waiting for me, some to welcome me, relatives and ancestors, and those who had come for something called teshuvah, which is not accurately translated as repentance in contemporary Jewish language, but it means to return back to one another, to reconcile, to repair the damage. So those who I've hurt in the other world come to me for my healing them, for the pain that I caused them. And then there are those who hurt me, who've come to me for me to help heal them. And in the process of the reciprocity of healing, the most astounding question asked of me is, will you surrender being a victim? Because being a victim is the most powerful thing in this world or in the next. Because as long as we live as a victim of somebody, we can always use that position to justify whatever we do. And so I learn and I teach others to live in this world not as victims, but as victors, as ones who have overcome that which challenged us. And in this process of going through it each time and working with souls who themselves were in need of healing, of repairing the damage, I have come to confront first the way I see myself in my own life, the things I could have done in this life that I didn't do. And boy, is that painful. You want to talk about hell, That's hell. And then I'm given to see my life through the eyes of others, those who loved me, those who learned from me, and those who felt rejected by me, and those who hated me. And I see the complexity of my visage to people. You know, the word in Hebrew for face is panim. It is the plural of the word pen, which means a corner or a vertex. So it's not that we look into a corner, it's that we look out of a corner, so that there are different vertices. Everybody has many faces. Our faces are always mobile, they're always moving. And so being face to face is sharing all of these profound aspects of ourselves as we move out of the physicality into the spirituality of being seen as to who and what we really have been and what we can be. So that coming back into the world has always led me into learning and doing other things with the people with whom I share, I teach, I meet privately, I meet in study groups. I hope that was clear.
That was very clear. I have so many questions for you.
By the way, I've also gone to retrieve souls at the edge of not coming back and have brought them back. I have several people who have videotaped those experiences, so I don't mind sharing them now. And I'm not the only one who's done that. It's not just me. But there are others who've had near-death experiences who, like me, have gone to the edge where if we had one, quote, step further, we would not have gone back. And in peering through that veil, I've seen that there are many other worlds beyond this that we will inhabit and that we will apply our gifts and our knowledge to take an incomplete existence, not sinful, not illusionary, but as the beginning says, not in the beginning God created, but when God began creating existence. So everything has a beginning, but existence is a gerund. It has no end. And each of us has a place here in fulfilling parts of bringing this existence towards some level of wholeness. And we will do that in stage and life after life after life.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's actually there is less suffering after you leave from the physical body.
Well, there is not the physical suffering, but there is the encountering of the soul suffering of those who have not found peace in themselves with their death. I mean, people like Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot or others who have been the cause of millions of people's deaths will have to stay in this place and encounter the millions of souls that they caused to die and all of those souls that were affected by it. So they will be in this place for uncounted eons of being until they can finally come to some point of being released from this place of purging, of cleansing. And so we all don't just get away. In my experience, there is no hell, that's eternal punishment. And there is no heaven, which is eternal reward. It is that all souls go to this place of cleansing and healing and moving to the next stages of work that are to be done. At those higher levels, there is difficulty and struggle and what we would call pain. But suffering is a psychological state. Pain and illness is a physical state. So while I'm in great pain and struggling to maintain myself, my consciousness remains clear, and I haven't given up on my life or anybody else's life. So I choose not to suffer.
And do you, when you leave the physical body, do you still get to maintain that identity as Stephen, or even that starts like diminishing?
No, there is a Hebrew word, hineni, which is a contraction of the word hine, which means here, and the word ani, which is I, hineni. And in one form or another, when God calls upon the prophets, they have to answer with some form of acknowledgement that they are present. And this term hineni, which is clearly articulated by the prophet Samuel, means this: I am here, and here am I. Not here I am, but here am I, so that the I of identity and the here of place are the same thing, so that never do I lose my identity, because in this world and in the next I am also a place. There is something I serve as a necessary quantity of existence. So, hineni, here I am here. Hineni, that is the constant of being. And learning to chant that word, to meditate it, is a way of calming down the anxiety. The word hineni is the word of being present. When Jacob runs away from Esau, his brother, after impersonating him to his father Isaac and stealing the birthright, he runs away to a place called Luz. It's a place where there had been Canaanite sacrifice of children, and he thought that no one would find him there, even God. And he took 7 stones from the place, he put them together, and he laid down to make a pillow. And he has this dream, or more importantly, a vision of a ladder going from earth heavenward, and there are malachim ascending and descending. Notice, not descending and ascending, but ascending and descending. And God is standing with Jacob at the base of the ladder, and God promises to go with Jacob in his travels if Jacob promises to serve God in his travels. And Jacob awakens, and he says, God is in this place, and I did not know it. And it teaches us that God is in every place, and every place is every physical place there is, but it's also every soul place. So hineni is, I am a place, and a place is my identity. So I am here, and here I am. Hine, here, ani, I. So that when we leave this world in what we call death, the I of identity never dies, and therefore we never stop being a place, a quantum of existence that is necessary to bring all of existence towards some form of wholeness, fulfillment. You know, the word shalom, which everybody says is peace, has a greater term underneath. It comes from the word shalom, which means to repair a tattered piece of fabric, to take something unfinished and make it whole. Shalom means wholeness, or in a modern sense, synergy. So there are two kinds of synergy we're taught. In school, in Western school, we were taught that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. Well, that's a value calculated on quantity. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts. There is another understanding of synergy, both in extreme physics and in the spiritual world, and that is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which means that in the wholeness there is something greater, that each of the parts woven together don't cease to exist in their being, but create a state of being that is greater than the integration, and that is calculation of value by quality, not by quantity. So that is living hineni by quality, not by quantity. And in understanding that we don't need to live by fear means we learn to live by quality, not by quantity, not by how much we have or how much we don't have, but rather the quality of our being, which is inestimable, because at the source of all of our being is the presence of the Holy One, who is the core of each of our souls.
And what did this teach you about the nature of consciousness?
The word soul and consciousness are similar. The word ruach, which means wind on one level, but is the second part of the soul, is consciousness. And it is not brain, but like wind, consciousness is outside the brain and expands and goes everywhere and can perceive that which is beyond it, which is why human consciousness can conceive and enact beyond the limitations of what brain can accomplish or see. Brain has its limitations for all kinds of physical reasons. So consciousness has to use the brain to communicate. So that consciousness is one aspect of our soul that's present. The primary source of our soul is called neshama, or what the Holy One breathes into Adam, neshama, nishmat chayim, the breath of living, the soul of presence, the unique being of each person's soul, which has its own unique qualities and deficits, and the things that it can accomplish in this world if each of us follow the paths that we do well in, rather than fight against those things that we don't do well in, which is what Western education always wants us to do. So when we follow what is the positive, generative parts of our soul, then we turn our ruach into the messenger of the soul's purpose, into consciousness, which then gets activated in the third level called nefesh, which is the life force in the body, so that the body is serving the soul's purpose, not just serving the need to eat and be filled and function in the world, so that the body is an instrument of the soul's purpose. So whatever the body goes through, as my body has gone through so much, it is to do what I'm doing now, to teach, to answer your questions, and hopefully to bring some light to subjects which are dark and murky.
You know, one could question that if this consciousness is all about love and everything, why does one has to go through all these physical challenges? Why is it not capable of healing? Like you went through so many physical challenges. Why was where was consciousness at that time where it could have helped you with those experiences and heal them?
It is because in Western civilization we have denigrated right brain consciousness. Everybody is taught from the beginning to be left brain, to do sequential thinking and learning, your numbers, your letters, your writing, your thinking, your critical approach, so that the creative, generative, psychological, spiritual quality of the right brain is really not very much accepted. In the Asian world, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, consciousness is much more a central portion of what it means to find meaning and purpose, so that physicality is not so central. And yet there are severe judgments made of the mistakes we made, so that karma ends up being a wheel of punishment rather than of elevation. The Jewish approach is much more similar to the Asian, actually, than to the Christian, because what we know in science is that the right brain is the dominant hemisphere through all of your years of growth from childhood to adulthood. And all the learning that happens comes through the right brain first and then to the left, so that when we learn, we don't learn to identify with what we're learning. We only learn to repeat it so that we can prove that we've learned it, instead of learning to play with the concepts, the ideas that come in from our consciousness. There is a place behind the right temple called the right prefrontal orbital cortex, which is the center they found for identity. It's a small ganglion of cells, but in it there is this image of the persona. And it is, I like to describe it like a hologram. You know, holograms are three-dimensional, but they're frequently unfinished. And the limbic system that responds to stimulus from the outside and knowledge and memory from the inside always connects with this image of self, with the I, with the here, with the I am here, with the hineni, with what does an experience mean. So for some people, an experience can have great positive meaning, and for others, it can have deep, horrendous meaning. Ah!
Oh my God.
No, I apologize.
No.
But see, that's the issue. You get startled, and the startle says that somewhere early in your life, you went through a sense of startle that instead of my doing that with other groups and some jumping like that and others kind of looking at me and laughing and saying, "What's the matter with you?" That the startle reflex tells us a lot about early childhood trauma and the bonding that happens between mother and child. I don't have much of a startle reflex, not because of what happened between me and my mother, but because of my near-death experience at birth and the traumas I went through from birth till age 5. And the sense of having to rely on myself because I couldn't rely on anybody else. So I apologize
no.
for scaring you so much. When I did that, what happened?
It was just a sense of alertness, like you have to be alert.
Yeah, alertness. And were you frightened of me?
No, just like it's kind of like a natural reflex to maybe there is a danger.
Yeah. You wouldn't have expected that from me, especially given the way you and I have been talking and how easy it is for us to sit and talk eye to eye without looking away, without feeling uncomfortable. That's presence. That's the meaning of attachment. And suddenly I disrupt the whole thing with this sound. And yet you return back to this without running away from me, because you weren't afraid of me, but you were shocked by a behavior that was inconsistent with me. That describes the strength of your, I'm finding the right word, of not being damaged by something that happens dramatically out of the ordinary. You are willing to come back quickly and to find your center and your place of connection. That's a great deal of balanced, straight presence. Others would be, I don't know, should we continue this anymore? So I do this as a way of demonstrating the issue of identity in relationship to what the world does to us. It may shock us, it may traumatize us, but we don't withdraw into dissociation. Remember that when a trauma happens and you see somebody who, as a result of an accident or a crime or war or an illness, seem to retreat into being unable to speak, it is because the trauma generates what's called dissociation. It's like my backing up 20 feet so that I'm no longer present. And you shut yourself down. And what that does, it sequesters the trauma in the right brain, and it stays and circles around constantly. But when that happens, what's been shown in studies at Harvard is that the left brain goes completely dark, that all analytical capacities cease to be. And the reason people in dissociation or post-traumatic states can't talk is because the capacity for speech in the left prefrontal orbital cortex, called Broca's area, means that you've lost real speech. So when you try and get people in trauma to talk, they can't, or they say things that make no sense. So what I teach people who are EMT and others is that when you're working with someone who's come out of trauma and they can't talk, don't try and get them to come out of it. Just hold them and tell them you're here and you're not going to go away, and leave them alone. Because that's what brings someone out of trauma. So when I work with someone who is in dissociation, frequently they'll describe it like being in a freezer, and I extend my hand and I say, if you'd like me to come in there and be with you, here's my hand, take me and draw me in. I'm not going to pull you out. And frequently I will get pulled into that place of dissociation with them, and in sharing it with them, the dissociation begins to discorporate, to come apart, and eventually they will be ready for me to lead them out and to help them go into meaningful healing work around the trauma. Because this dissociation can happen as early as prenatal and can continue all the way through the development of the adult brain, which is why you meet people who are so constantly shut down. When you put that together with the teachings of consciousness, you know that what's happened in that trauma is that the brain has driven consciousness out and said, I don't want to know. And consciousness cannot use the brain to heal it until it begins to open up, which is too complicated a process to go through here, though I wrote about it in my dissertation. We are an incredible complex system between our brains, our thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary, our autonomic nervous system, and our autoimmune system to deal with this triangle, like the triangle I talked about before in healing and sustaining the post-traumatic world that most of us live in, so that our immune systems are not constantly going crazy with all of our inability to handle the traumas we live with. That's the kind of work I do, and it brings together both the right brain and the left brain, so the synergy takes place. So there is a real communication between right and left. And there are some just very simple methodologies I can teach people in order to have that happen.
It's very interesting you mentioned that, because there are other older traditions which talk about unification of the right brain and left brain, how that's key for an awakening.
Yes, it is. And I have developed a very simple way for doing it. And it is a simple placement of hands on the head for a short period of time, moving it in several motions, moving it around the jaw, and suddenly the mind will go blank.
Can you talk a little bit about light body? What's your experience with light body?
Light body, astral body, this is what happens as we leave the physical and we become pure. There are so many mystical traditions from other mystical sources that talk about some kind of light body, astral body. My experience of that is that in becoming a soul, we eventually are formed into what would be a light body before that body of light can itself be formed into more concise, compacted form as it enters the physical body. So a light body is that soul being which is itself only the flowing of the presence of God's light as it flows into existence and makes each of us a being, a body that carries that light into the world.
Is it possible to, like some people talk about light body activation, do you think that's something possible on the physical realm?
It depends on from what tradition you're talking about it. What you're really dealing with in the light body image, from my experience, is moments of transcendence, when we are having a spiritual transcendent experience and we leave our bodies and our consciousness takes us and we ascend into a realm in which we are no longer limited by body, but are experiencing this sense of wholeness along with all other consciousness. So that sense of the spiritual transcendence in the flowing of our light from our physical bodies, whether it's in meditation or prayer or in some form of healing or of some physical activity like yoga, that in which you become beyond your body. I've had that experience. I used to do very intense long-distance road biking. So I would ride from here in Marina del Rey to Santa Barbara and back in a day. That's 200 miles. And when you get into a rhythm of the bike going and your body reacts to the motion of the bike and the road, that after a while my consciousness just leaves and is soaring above the bike and is off on some other communication or transcendence. I've done it, and I did high altitude mountain biking in Colorado along the Colorado Trail when in the biking going along a ridge, and this ridge is a cliff down this way and a cliff up this way, and I'm careening down it because you have to go fast in order to not fall, and the feeling of just trusting the bike like you trust the horse, and trusting me and letting my soul go instead of holding on to the fear, and the transcendence that comes. I know this happens with people, as I said, in yoga or in other physical activities, people who do long distance swimming, people who do rock climbing, etc., have these moments in which their soul leaves their body and becomes a light body, a transcendent being. That's how I experience it and understand it.
What do you think is the next step for evolution of human body in terms of consciousness? Where do you see this going?
Well, this having the confluence of the crisis with the planet, with the crisis of the world economy, with COVID, and with the rise of the autocratic, that the wealthy deserve what they get and the poor deserve what they get, is a moment in which we are being challenged to rise to this new level of consciousness. And as I said before, not just individually, though that's where it begins, but at every level of social integration with each other, with our families, with our extended communities, with our governments, with our country, with the world around us, to know that we can't just save this or we can't just save that, but our responsibility is to, and not save, but to reclaim all that is, all that was, and all that can be. So it's not an issue of saving, it's a matter of reclaiming our heritage, which has been stolen from us by so many people, by so many groups and governments and businesses. And it is time in this reclamation to find the unity of all being, and that it is time for all of the spiritual, religious traditions to work together. I had the unusual experience when I was the campus rabbi, the Hillel director at UC Berkeley. There was a institution called the Graduate Theological Union, which was just north of the Berkeley campus. It was 9 Christian seminaries and a Buddhist center, and I was, without going into details, invited to teach at the Jesuit School of Theology and Bible. And I taught with a Monsignor named Jake Emperor, of all things, about the origins of Catholic Christian spirituality in Judaism. And as a result of that, I ended up teaching that and other things in terms of the reading of Bible for over 4 years before I left. And one of the profound differences between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism is that the Christianity in both its forms takes the Bible literally. So does Islam. Judaism never took the Bible literally. It is a metaphor to be turned over and explored and looked at. It sets forth a way of thinking in that we must not be rigid and be stuck in one plane of perception, but dig and dig and dig and reach, which is what human consciousness is now doing. So when I taught that, this approach to biblical text, it caused a real problem for a while. And then for my teaching there, it had to be approved by Rome, because no rabbi had ever done it before. And they had to check with Rome every once in a while about the things I was telling people, and they said, let the rabbi explain. It so happened that there was a convocation of the faculty of the Jesuit School of Theology and Bible with other Jesuit Catholic seminaries, and there was a cardinal who was the guest speaker. And so I never responded to the invitation to go, because why would I go there? And I got a call from the dean of the school. He says, Rabbi, we don't have your response to the invitation to come. So why would you want me to come? This is a church convocation. Prelates, they don't want me. They don't need me. And they said, no, in fact, you're specifically invited. You are to give the blessing over the meal. I said, what? He said, yes, we want you to give the blessing over the meal. I said, but you're all going to be dressed in your robes. He said, you dress however you want. So I put on a suit and I put on a very big colored prayer shawl, talit, that I wear. And I explained the blessing over the wine and over the bread, which is very different than the Catholic understanding of it. And I did it, and the cardinal was next to the podium where I was standing, and I asked the cardinal if he would stand up. We held the bread, the braided bread, because instead of a regular loaf, I brought a challah, which is 6 braids of bread, 6 strands of bread woven together. And it represents how the 6 days of the week are woven together to produce life. And that's what so I brought that, and the cardinal and I broke it, and I sat down. Well, I didn't sit down, I went to leave. And the dean said, where are you going? I said, well, I'm looking for my seat. He said, that's your seat. It was right next to the cardinal. I was very surprised. I sat down, and Your Eminence, it's a pleasure to meet you. He said, so he had me call him by his first name. He said, I assume I can call you Steve. I said, of course. He said, tell me something. He said, why is it, and I don't want this to come down the wrong way. He said, why is it that Jewish children excel in school? Why is it that they excel in work and in business? The level of Jewish accomplishment is profound. And I said, it is the requirement from the beginning at Mount Sinai that all Jews must learn to read, both male and female. and that the Torah, the biblical script, belongs to everybody, not just to the rabbis. So that when the temple was destroyed and the priesthood and the offerings, what are called sacrifices, went out of existence, there was already the early synagogue and the early rabbis available to create and to form a very different kind of religion that was based upon community, the study of Torah, and the expounding of the meaning of the words of God. And I said, so he said, so all children have to learn to read? And I said, yes. And I said, let me give you an example. We do bar mitzvah and now bat mitzvah at 13. To accomplish that, a child has to really study and learn the meaning of things, learn a language other than the English they're learning, and they lead a service, and they have to talk about the portion of the Torah that they've read and what it means to them. And then they're considered to be an adult. And I said, and what is it that you do to making a child an adult? I said, they finish catechism and they can go up and receive the host on their own. They don't have to be accompanied by their parents. He said, that's right. And I said, that makes them still subservient, and they don't have the right for their own voice. They don't stand up and speak on the pulpit, because that pulpit is the place only for the anointed, not for the average people. Understand that you are a holy man. You are beyond everyday human existence. I'm a rabbi. I'm like everybody else. I'm not more holy. I'm not more valuable. I just have focused my life in the service of teaching and of expounding and of living out the values of the faith that I was given in my soul. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It only means that I'm answering your question the best I can. It is that Jewish children from the very beginning are expected to learn, to know, and to enact. When I was a campus rabbi, the most tragic thing that could ever happen to a Jewish child was to be expelled from college. Intermarriage, drugs, anything else was nothing compared to the mourning of not being able to stay in college. That was like a death sentence. And that understanding still applies. Without a college degree, there aren't many things you can do anymore. And even a college degree, a BA, is now like a high school diploma. So the need for more and more education is a constant, and yet the American society has done nothing but dumb down education. So we have a less educated population than we were supposed to have.
Do you think all these different religions are kind of pointing to the same thing?
And what do you mean by that?
It's not like one religion is better than the
No. It says very clearly in our tradition, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. Being a good Catholic, a good Muslim, a good Buddhist, a good Hindu, means working toward the height of service that is established in each path of faith. That's why Judaism is not particularistic salvation. You don't have to become a Jew to be saved. You don't have to be like me in order to be taken up to heaven. You don't have to meet a certain set of standards. All souls return to God. That's always been the Jewish position. I know that the nature of the Catholic world, given Pope Francis and his opening up of the Catholic world has created a whole new sense of awareness and responsibility. The same with much of the, I would say, the liberal midline Christian denominations have. But there is the emergence of the right wing of religions that appear in every religion, including Judaism, that demand that you stick to the word, to the observance, and to the rejection of all else. So I developed, along with a friend of mine, an academy for Jewish religion, which is trans-denominational. So the faculty is both Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, Reconstructionist, renewal, secular scholars, teaching men and women to be rabbis, cantors, and chaplains. And it is the understanding that the divisions destroy, but that the individual pathways have purpose if we all work together. That's why very soon, and I'm stating this before it's public, is that the Academy for Jewish Religion California will be opening up its new premises on Loyola Marymount University campus. And we will be sharing programs together. We will, of course, retain our own accreditation as the AJR CA, but we will be working together on programs in Judaica and other things. So that's a startling step toward working toward the same goal, which is bringing a sense of wholeness, completion through respect and recognition of the value of every pathway's legitimacy and necessity to be in this world.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think this was a really rich conversation, and it's valuable to learn from all these older traditions because in modern world it kind of gets lost.
Yes, they do.
So thank you so much for your time today. I think this was a very enriching conversation, and I'm sure we'll get back in touch because we are only scratching the surface.
Well, I'm so pleased with this, and for the very thoughtful questions you asked. I'll be happy to return again.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to have you back and get some more insights. And I also want to thank the viewers to watch this video, and if you find this valuable, please remember to subscribe, and thank you for your support.